Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we're listening to the Children's Institute 2022 closing keynote with Ci Anders.
Hello, fellow booksellers. If you ever watch my virtual events or my TikToks, I always say, I'm Candace, owner of Tubby & Coos, Mid-City Bookshop, and I am so excited to be here with all of you in person for the first time, my first in-person event in like years. So it's very cool to see all of your faces. And I'm so excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Ci Anders, who is absolutely one of my most favorite authors of all time. And Ci is the author of the young adult Unstoppable trilogy, which began with Victories Greater Than Death and continued with Dreams Bigger Than Heartbreak. She has also written the short story collection Even Greater Mistakes, which is also amazing, and adult novels The City in the Middle of the Night and All the Birds in the Sky, which is legitimately one of my personal favorite books of all time. If you have not read All the Birds in the Sky, it is amazing. And she also wrote the nonfiction book Never Say You Can't Survive, which is a writing book, but also so much more, and everyone should read it to gain hope about getting through hard times. Ci has won the Hugo, the Nebula, the Sturgeon, Lambda Literary, Crawford, and Locus Awards, and her fiction and journalism have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, Tour.com, and a million other places. Her TED Talk, Go Ahead and Dream About the Future, got 700,000 views in the first week because she is just that amazing. With Annalee Newitt, she also co-hosts one of my favorite podcasts, Our Opinions Are Correct. If you don't listen to it, you should. I have also had the privilege of being on a cruise ship with Ci Anders and having conversations with her and hosting her for virtual events, and I can confidently say that she is one of the best, most inspirational people I have ever met, and it makes my nerdy little soul so happy to introduce and welcome Ci Anders.
Thank you so much, Candace. That was so wonderful, and I appreciate you so much, and I appreciate all of you so much. So, first off, if you can't hear me at any point, just let me know. Just raise your hand or whatever. If you can't hear me in the back, and I will speak up. Can you hear me so far? Good? Yes? Great. Okay, I'm going to jump right in. I've jumped universes 3 or 4 times in my life. This is definitely not the universe that I was born in. And looking out at all of you, I am sure that I'm not the only one who has stepped through a portal into a new realm once upon a time. Right? Yeah, show of hands. Okay, so far so good. Yeah, I'm sure most of us have done it. A hole opens up in the fabric of reality and you just saunter right through. Sometimes even if you don't decide to walk through a magical portal, you might find yourself just slipping into a new universe without even realizing it. I know a lot of people who spent years thought they were living in Mordor, but then one day they looked up and realized they were living in Elfland instead. It can be challenging. Things change around you, basically. So today, I'm going to talk about magical portals and why they are real and frequently amazing, usually amazing. And spoiler alert, I'm also going to end up by talking about why bookstores are actually interdimensional nexuses, collections of thousands of portals to other realms. I never miss a chance to shout about my love of bookstores, just heads up. But this talk is also about how I was a visibly queer kid with a really severe learning disability who was doomed to never graduate from 3rd grade. Until I escaped into fantasy. And now, years later, I'm working to create the fantasies that I hope will help other people get through their own scary, tough times. But back to magical portals. It starts out with recognizing that our world is made out of stories. Okay, so sometimes we talk about stories as if they're some kind of special, magical, separate thing, like miracles or whatever. Like, I will often say that stories have saved my life, which is true, and we'll get to that. But everything is a story. You eat stories for breakfast and navigate through a series of stories on your way to and from work where no matter what your job is, you handle stories for a living. Obviously, most of you literally handle stories for a living, but if you work at an insurance company, you are working with stories all the time. That's your job. You are wearing stories on your feet right now. Seriously, where did you get your shoes? Where were they made? Where was that shoe store? And did it used to be a video game store? Is the shoe store a Jamba Juice now? Everything is a Jamba Juice now. By the time I'm finished with this talk, this space we're standing in will be a Jamba Juice. I guarantee it. You probably know 10 things about the history of the brand that your shoes are. Nothing is just what it is. Everything is covered with signifiers. And obviously, our world is full of pop culture and other ways that stories affect us, but also our politics. You know, this is why politicians obsess about controlling the narrative. And, you know, we're more likely to vote based on feelings and based on a scary anecdote. Like, for example, you might vote to ban chewing gum because you heard a really scary story about someone who choked to death on chewing gum versus like a bunch of statistics and facts which don't really affect us the same way. Stories are almost like another sense on top of sight, hearing, touch, etc., etc. They help us make sense of the world. So we often talk as if we have a choice between playing make-believe on the one hand and, you know, accepting reality on the other hand. And the latter, accepting reality, is more responsible and more serious. But increasingly, I feel as though both of those options are just two different flavors of playing make-believe. Accepting reality is still playing make-believe. It's just playing the same make-believe as everybody else, I guess. When I was a little kid, my father sat me down and told me something that has stuck with me for my entire life. He said that adults do not exist. Pretty much all grown-ups are just children, pretending that we have figured stuff out. People never actually grow up. They just get better at faking it. And that sounds kind of cynical, but when I say it out loud, but actually it was super liberating and positive when I heard it as a kid, because as a kid, I was constantly at sea. And I felt as though everybody else had their act together, and I couldn't imagine growing up to become somebody who knew what they were doing, and of course I didn't. So it was incredibly reassuring to be let in on the big secret of adulthood. So, with me so far, magical portals absolutely exist, and adults are a fairy tale. Got it? Great. Okay. So, the first time a portal opened up in front of me, I was like 7 years old. I was dreaming and fantasizing and yearning for a doorway to open up and lead me to another world, and then it happened. Okay, I mentioned earlier, I was a kid who had a really intense learning disability. My elementary school teachers could not deal with me at all, and you know, I was reading above my grade level, but I couldn't write to save my life. Like, I couldn't make words. My letters of the alphabet were illegible. I couldn't do basic math, even a little bit. My parents were both college professors, and my dad in particular had been a child prodigy, and they just didn't know what to do with a kid who was that learning challenged. And surprisingly, being super nerdy and terrible at school was not a great combination for my social status among my peers, you can imagine. So that's why I spent so much time just dreaming of getting away to another world. Maybe a spaceship would swoop down onto the schoolyard and just take me away. Maybe some aliens would tell me that I didn't really belong on this planet, and I was actually one of them. And I later poured all of that childhood longing into my young adult novel, Victories Greater Than Death, which you heard about a moment ago, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a while. You know, I wandered around on the edge of the schoolyard near the chicken wire fence, making up stories in my own head. I had an imaginary superhero that I created named Zappo-Man, who had the power to zap people. That was pretty much his whole thing. He didn't really have much besides that. And I spent a lot of time making maps in my head of superhero headquarters and magical realms. Then the luckiest thing happened to me. I was identified as a special needs child, and I was sent to this special ed teacher who had just started working at the school named Lynn Pennington. And the lengths that she went for me still kind of blow my mind. Right away, Miss Pennington kind of saw that I was a daydreamer and that I would get lost in my own fantasy world. And instead of trying to crush that part of me to turn me into a good student, she decided to use it to help me to learn. I honestly don't know who I'd be or where I'd be today if it wasn't for her. We're still friends, and we had dinner a while back, and we email pretty often. I'm always telling her what a huge difference she made in my life. So instead of just drilling me on letters, Ms. Pennington helped me to figure it out on my own. Like, if I could just write one good letter A, she would try to help me realize why that was correct. And instead of just pushing me on math, she took me to a specialist who figured out what was wrong and how to start fixing it. I remember it almost being like a blight was lifting in my head. And Ms. Pennington gave me lots of encouragement and lots of gold stars, but she also offered me the best bribe ever. If I mastered all of my writing skills and got up to speed on my classwork, then I could write a play. And it would actually get performed at school. Toward the end of the first grade, I wrote a stage play called The Bad Cad, C-A-D, about a flamboyant troublemaker who pranks an authority figure who was played by my older brother in like the one performance. Ms. Pennington recently emailed me some old photos of the single performance of The Bad Cat, and if you look at my newsletter, you can see them. I feel like I've been writing stories about the bad cat my entire life, actually, from Patricia the Witch in All the Birds in the Sky, who accesses her inner trickster to escape from bad situations, to Tina in Victories Greater Than Death, who channels her passion to become an epic hero into pranking local dirtbags on Earth. So later in like third or fourth grade, Miss Pennington also got me to create a fake newspaper crammed with terrible jokes, like the president's cabinet is full of like weird kitchen stuff. And she took me to visit an actual newspaper where I got to see the Buick-sized rolls of paper and the printing press in the basement, and that's pretty much probably why I ended up working as a newspaper after I graduated from college. Miss Pennington met me where I was, and she basically opened up that doorway that I'd been looking for, and in the process, she turned me into a lifelong writer. Even if she might have ended up regretting it a little bit, she recently told me that after I had mastered like being able to put words on the page, I pretty much spent all my time writing Doctor Who fan fiction in my class notebooks instead of paying attention like I was supposed to. So, swings and roundabouts. So I think about my gender transition as pretty much another magical gateway that I stepped through. And around the same time that I started transitioning from male to female, I also became part of a whole queer performance scene, including a lot of pranksters who could have given the bad cad a run for their money. I spent a lot of my 20s kind of trying to be a serious person, trying to adult. I got married, I had a high-pressure job in journalism, we had a nice house, I had sophisticated outings with friends. I was not super happy, and not just because I was trying to live as the wrong gender. I was kind of forgetting the thing my dad told me when I was a kid, I guess. My gender transition came around the same time that I accepted that I was never going to be a terribly serious person. I always say that I'm not a weirdo because I'm trans, and I'm not trans because I'm a weirdo. Those are just two unrelated things that I happen to be. But I did come out as both of those things around the same time, and being a weirdo gave me a lot of freedom to experiment with my gender presentation, which I think, kind of led to the person you see now. To quote G.K. Chesterton, misquoting Oscar Wilde, life is far too important to be taken seriously. So another way of thinking about it is when I transitioned, I was kind of rewriting my own narrative and changing my own story as a means of kind of discovering myself. And I was pretty new to writing fiction at that time, and I saw myself very much as an absurdist writer. I tried to write the most gonzo stories I could in order to expose the ridiculousness of all the stuff that we take for granted in the real world. And a lot of my early stories were kind of an excuse in coming up with the most gonzo premises that I could come up with and then challenging myself like, can I pull this off? And the answer most of the time was, Maybe, I don't know. My characters were very one-dimensional, and they mostly just got flung into one nonsensical situation after another. But I also wrote a lot of queer literary stories for small press publications, and the more I wrote about queer characters in outrageous situations, the more I was kind of filling in the outlines of my own world. And I guess that once you have stepped through a portal, then you have to be able to recognize yourself in this new setting, right? And that's part of what I love about writing. It doesn't just transport you, it helps you to arrive, which is a whole separate thing. So San Francisco at the time was full of queer performance salons and open mics and events where you could watch an Elvis impersonator sing Love Me Tender while live chickens were eating feed off of his body, which is a thing I watched once, sorry. A woman I used to know named Kim organized a skipping group where once a month a group of us would get together and just skip down the sidewalk for an hour, and that was actually really nice. It was good exercise. I worked behind the scenes at drag shows and other queer events, and eventually I started to organize my own stuff because I found that organizing a kind of a strange party can be another way of opening a door. Probably the most notorious shindig I ever organized was the ballerina pie fight, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. A dozen or so ballerinas doing a ballet performance and throwing pies at each other. I didn't realize at first how much work it was going to be to stage a pie fight, let alone one entirely made up of ballerinas. It kind of took an army to make this happen. Just making the costumes was a major undertaking, but we also needed hundreds of pies, which is a lot. Massive stroke of luck, we found someone who had worked behind the scenes on a movie called The Nut House with 2 T's, which had the biggest pie fight in movie history. They used something like 50,000 pies on that movie, and she taught us how to become pie-making machines. We rented this big performance space, and we covered the wall and the floor and the ceiling with tarps, and then we taped garbage bags over the tarps, and we still were up all night doing cleanup. It was ridiculous and intense and grotesque. And, finally at 4 in the morning, we were we're done with the cleanup. And then we looked up at the ceiling, which was 20 feet up, and there was a little bit of pie filling up there, and we had to go get a ladder. It was Afterward, a bunch of people came up to me and said, that was the most amazing night, and when were we going to do it again? And I was never. We are never doing that again. Are you kidding me? I also started organizing a spoken word show that I'm still doing today called Writers with Drinks, which happens at a bar in San Francisco. Writers with Drinks features as many genres and styles and communities as I can cram into one show: poetry, literary fiction, science fiction, romance, journalism, so on and so forth. The other thing about Writers with Drinks is to kind of make it less of a solemn event. I make up silly fake bios for all the readers. When I introduced Audrey Niffenegger, I said that she was the court artist to the Silhouette Empress, who was a collection of shadows whose beauty had never been captured on paper until Audrey drew all of her subtle shades and lacy edges. And there was a lot more to it, like Audrey escaping on a rocket made out of paper and stuff. And I was inspired by Audrey's incredible papercraft and artwork, which if you have not seen Audrey Niffenegger's artwork, go look at it. It's amazing. But also the ornateness of her storytelling. Making up kind of ridiculous bios for 100 authors per year has been just great training in mental flexibility and coming up with story twists under pressure. At first, I used to just spout off bizarre non sequiturs on stage that I would kind of make up beforehand, but also improv on the spot. And over time, I started to spend more time thinking about each reader and why I had wanted to have them at this event, and try to conjure a fanciful version of them that reflected why the real person was so wonderful. And I think, the bios got better as a result of that kind of thinking about it. And that brings me to another kind of doorway that I've stepped through in recent years, around the same time that my intros got more kind of thoughtful and sort of more reflective of the people I was talking about. I also went from writing stories, which were just a bunch of random wackiness happening, to actually trying to create characters with real inner lives and emotions who hopefully grow and change and go on an emotional journey and all that. So I mentioned earlier that I used to daydream all the time when I was a kid, right? But as an adult, I was really hard on myself about daydreaming. I was so into the notion of productivity as a writer. as expressed in the number of words that I could produce on any given day. The larger the number of new words that I had added to my opus, the more successful I felt as an author. And that was definitely an easy metric to track, and it made me feel good when I hit my goal. And then I would beat myself up if I spent too much time staring into space instead of producing words in the time that I had. Even though almost everything good in my life has come from daydreaming, it took me way too long to realize that my best ideas and the most interesting scenes came after one of those window-gazing moments. I would zone out for a while, and then after zoning out, I would know what was going on in my characters' heads and what they were going to do next and what would be the most interesting thing. And the longer I go on as a writer, the more sure I am that a lot of my best writing comes out of my unconscious as well as my conscious mind. And the hardest and best part of the job is getting out of my head and into the heads of these imaginary people. And when I zone out and stop paying attention to anything in particular, I can kind of start drawing connections that I might not find otherwise. Like, I kind of think of daydreaming as being the opposite of doom scrolling. It's kind of true though, right? Like, the world is trying very hard right now to keep us all scared out of our wits, because fear causes us to close off possibilities and to stop being curious about the world. Like, to misquote Dune, fear is the portal closer, in a way, if you think about it like that. Lately, when I'm signing books for people and I can't think of what else to write or draw, or I'm in a hurry, I always write the same thing at the top of the page. Daydreaming is important, serious work. And I always write the word work in capital letters and underline it 3 or 4 times to just get it across. Daydreaming is work. It's work that we have to do. It's important. We should get paid. Sorry, anyway. These days I spend more and more time trying to kind of become different characters as I write them. I always say writing is acting, and I really believe that that's true. And I like learning more about my characters as I'm writing them, like learning stuff I didn't know when I started. But I also really like figuring out stuff at the same time as my characters are figuring it out. I like when my characters have a realization, that's usually me having the realization at the same time alongside them. So to return to the thing about adults not being real, like I said earlier, I think that's part of why it's so important and awesome to get into someone's internal monologue and show how they're struggling to keep up the act of adulthood. I love peeling back the layers of a character and kind of getting to see all the self-deception, prevarication, the doubts, the qualms. For so long, I just thought of characters as a vehicle to get the story where I wanted it to go, but after I became more conscious about kind of recreating myself, I feel like that was the first step towards getting to create characters that I was interested in for their own sake. And, another thing that's really important to me as a writer is extreme intentionality. I talk about this a lot in the writing advice book Candace mentioned, Never Say You Can't Survive. I spend a lot of time just asking myself questions about, what does the story mean to me? And what do I want it to be about? And another light bulb moment that I had as a writer, which I really think applies to other life situations, is I realized eventually that I could use playfulness and a sense of absurdity to deal with some utterly heartbreaking, terrifying, upsetting stuff. I always kind of knew this in my head, but it took a long time for me to figure it out in my bones. I want to talk about 2 short stories that are in my recent collection, Even Greater Mistakes. I have this one short story called Ratcatcher's Yellows that's about having a loved one who is dealing with dementia, which is a thing that's affected a lot of people in my family. It's a thing that a lot of people I know have struggled with. And, this story is about some really heavy, intense stuff, but it's also about Renaissance cats in a game where one of the characters is named Lord Hairballington, which is a great name for a Renaissance cat, I think. I don't know. And then there's this story I wrote back in 2017 called Don't Press Charges and I Won't Sue. Junot Diaz published it in the Boston Review's Global Dystopias issue, and here's where things, this is getting a little bit heavier. 5 years ago, I started to get really scared for trans people in this country. That was when states started trying to pass bills basically saying that trans people more or less couldn't use public restrooms, which I have the bladder of a 90-year-old woman. You saw me taking like 3 bathroom breaks before I got up here because, that's part of who I am. I need to pee all the time. And it's a problem, and I wish I'd been wrong about where things were heading, but unfortunately, now trans people are in the crosshairs more than ever with a wave of violence and state discrimination fueled by a never-ending drumbeat of moral panic in the media. And it's getting scarier and scarier right now to be a trans person in America or pretty much anywhere in the world. Especially trans people of color are just on the front lines right now. It's really a lot. So I tried to address those fears in the story, Don't Press Charges, by writing a straight-up horror story about the worst that could happen to trans people. And I showed that story to a ton of trans people before I sent it to Junot Diaz. And they all said things like, that was good, but I had to lie down after reading it. It's a really intense story. I still can't read that story aloud without basically bursting into tears. But the weird thing is, it's one of the funniest stories I ever wrote. It's full of silly jokes and quirky moments. And I felt like being kind of like zany and fanciful allowed me to get closer to the emotional truth of this really upsetting experience rather than distracting from it. And so I feel like embracing silliness kind of isn't just a way of getting away from the serious and awful things in the world. It's a way of kind of grappling with them. It's a way of getting into them. And it's something that, again, I feel like that's a thing that I've found useful in life as well as in writing. So finally, here I am at the Children's Institute. I want to talk about how much I love children's stories. So when I daydreamed as a kid, until that portal finally opened up for me, I wouldn't have even had all the material for those daydreams if I hadn't had so many amazing children's stories to launch me into fantasy. I loved oddball stories like The Phantom Tollbooth, A Wrinkle in Time, Paddington Bear, everything Daniel Pinkwater ever wrote. Daniel Pinkwater, he is the greatest, you guys, everybody. For a while, I lived in a place that had an actual children's bookstore, and I just spent half my life there when I wasn't at the library. In middle school, my best friend Jake and I made a huge mural of the Mathematician from the Phantom Tollbooth, like covering a whole wall at the school. One thing I obsess about a lot lately is the fact that almost all of the popular fictional characters today were created for kids and then claimed by adults, like superheroes, fantasy characters, everybody in Star Wars, so on and so forth. It's all kids' stories that adults now kind of claim. People grew up loving those stories, and then when they were grown up, they didn't want to stop loving them. So they demanded that those characters change and become more mature and more sophisticated. Soon, those characters aren't for kids anymore. There's this amazing interview with comic book writer Grant Morrison, and I'm just going to quote from it. I'm going to bleep out all the curse words because we're at the Children's Institute. Grant Morrison said, and I'm not going to try to do a British accent either. I'm not going to subject you to that. People say kids can't understand the difference between fact and fiction, but that's bull. Boop. Kids understand that real crabs don't sing like the ones in The Little Mermaid. But you give an adult fiction and they start asking dumb questions like, why can Superman fly? How do those I-beams work? Who pumps the Batmobile's tires? It's a made-up story, you boop. Nobody pumps the tires. Which is true. Nobody pumps the Batmobile's tires. It's magic. It's a story for kids. The Batmobile is for kids. His name is Batman and he drives a car called the Batmobile. That's a story for kids. Come on. He throws batarangs. Come on. Anyway, I don't think there's anything wrong with adults wanting their favorite stories to grow up along with them. Since we're all pretending to be adults, we want our heroes to pretend along with us, right? I think that this is a natural process. I don't think that the answer is to demand that Batman be for kids again, because that boat has sailed. It's too late. But I do think we all need to keep creating new characters for kids so the process can start all over again, and eventually those characters can be for adults, I guess. I would love to live, I know this is going to upset some people, but I would love to live in a world where every character created in the 20th century has been gently forgotten. And we have a whole new set of characters who, incidentally, might better reflect the diversity and richness and beauty of our world, because they might be created by a broader range of creators, and they can inspire us in new ways. I have no illusion that I'm the one who's going to make any of this happen, but I'm doing my small part over here. Around the same time I wrote that story, Don't Press Charges, that I mentioned, I started working on that young adult space fantasy trilogy that's basically like, it's in the same general ballpark genre as Star Wars, Star Trek, Guardians of the Galaxy. The first two books, Victories Greater Than Death and Promises Bigger Than Heartbreak, are out now, and the third is out next April. Sorry, end of plug. Most of those heroes are defiantly, beautifully queer, and they all support each other and hold each other up as they question their identities while saving all of the worlds. I had so much fun coming up with all the alien societies and technologies and backstory and side story and around story. I made a whole wiki just crammed with details. But I had even more fun creating characters who question what it means to be a hero and whether violence is the best solution to our problems. And I decided in my world, nobody touches anybody else without asking for consent first, unless it's a fight scene. People don't ask for consent to touch you in a fight scene. And the universal translator makes it so that you can never use the wrong pronoun for anybody, which was something that I was like, that's a thing I'd like to see. Thank you. And the worst things have gotten for trans people around the world, the more comfort I try to pack into these stories, in which trans and non-binary and gender fluid characters become powerful and embrace their creativity while supporting each other. I'm not going to give you a plot synopsis, but Tina's the second coming of an epic hero who decides to become something way better than an epic hero. Rachel is a dreamy artist who saves everybody by reconnecting with her creativity. And Elsa's a trans nerd who fights to become a cyber princess. You know, I just want to say it, marginalized people need our own heroes right now. We need to see ourselves overcoming obstacles and lifting each other up. It's a cliche, but I really want kids to be able to see themselves in a way that I wasn't able to when I was a kid. See themselves reflected in fiction, I mean. Also, today is a big day for me, and not just because I'm getting the amazing honor of speaking to a room full of wonderful booksellers. Today is the debut of a new transgender superhero that I co-created for Marvel Comics. I'm almost done, I swear. So her name is Escapade, and she's a trickster, and she uses cool gadgets like gravity dice to steal from terrible people. And her best friend is also a trans character named Morgan. He has amazing sweater vests and bow ties, and their pet is a flying turtle named Hibbert. The Marvel's 2022 Pride issue is in stores today, and that's their debut, and I hope that soon they'll be everywhere. So I just want to end up by talking about community. I've been talking a lot about my individual journey, but what I found over and over again is that more than any individual making their own way, communities are what make us possible. And the heroic stories that I love most are the ones that celebrate chosen family. Whenever I host an event or whenever I do anything, I think about how to make it as inclusive and welcoming to as many people as I possibly can. And I think a fictional world is only as good as the communities that it depicts. When I've talked about keeping an eye open for those portals that might open up to let you traverse them, those portals always lead to a community that you could be a part of. And as I said at the start, a bookstore is basically one portal that leads to an endless series of other portals. Bookstores create communities in the real world, but they also let you visit as many fictional worlds as you want. It is magic. I visited cities where all the independent bookstores had gone away, and it was the saddest thing ever. There was just like sadness hanging over everything. For the past 10 years, I've been putting a lot of energy into organizing stuff to help support local bookstores in my area. Starting in 2020, Starting in 2012, we've been organizing the bookstore and chocolate crawl, where we get like 100 or so people, and we walk around a neighborhood eating chocolate and then visiting local bookstores and browsing. People just walk out with armfuls of books and their new best friend. And in the spring and summer of 2020, I was part of a group of people organizing a series of Zoom events called We Love Bookstores that raised I think over $63,000 for local bookstores in the Bay Area. It was very much a team effort. It was a huge team effort. Maggie Tokuda Hall, who's also a YA author, was a huge part of that, and she worked her tail off. Since we started off with Candace embarrassing me, I want to finish by returning the favor. Candace is one of the people I've met, one of a bunch of people I've met who have and hung out with in recent years who decided to open a new indie bookstore from scratch or buy and refurbish a venerable bookstore. They saw a place where a portal could be opened, and they didn't wait around for it to happen. They created it themselves with playfulness and intentional weirdness and incredible Zoom events where they make up RPGs with the author's characters. With so many possibilities being closed off, with so many people in the world right now devoting themselves to blockading every way forward for so many of us. When I meet someone like Candace, or like so many of you who are working so hard to open up new ways for us to live and discover ourselves, I fangirl so hard. So I mean it, I really mean it from the bottom of my heart when I say that y'all are my heroes every freaking day. Thank you so much. There's questions. Thank you so much. I almost got off stage, but then I remembered we're gonna do a Q&A. And I have t-shirts. If you ask a question, Eileen's gonna give you a t-shirt. So there's about 8 t-shirts. And there's a mic. Eileen has a mic and t-shirts.
Oh, wait, yay, okay.
Yay, okay.
So I will bring the mic to you and a t-shirt, and I am totally ready and excited.
Anybody?
Thank you all. All right, come on.
Anybody? I'll just take all the t-shirts and wear them myself. No,
Yay!
Okay.
You're close.
Okay, cool.
I'll break the seal. Hello. Indie bookstores love you as much as you love indie bookstores. Is there something you would love to see us doing more of as we continue to open those portals?
Oh my gosh, that's a really great question. Is there anything I'd like to see indie bookstores do more of? I mean, I love when indie bookstores have, make a point of including marginalized authors of all kinds in events. I think that that's wonderful. I will say this, actually, and please take this in the spirit of love and appreciation, but since you asked for what I thought people could do better, sometimes I walk into an indie bookstore and I see in the fiction section, I see lots of shelf talkers for books by women and BIPOC and trans and queer authors, and then I go into the science fiction section, and I see shelf talkers only next to like Isaac Asimov and Robert A. Heinlein and Andy Weir, who I love Andy Weir, and I'm just like, I wish that the people who are doing the shelf talkers in the fiction section and maybe also in the YA section would make their way over to the sci-fi section and put a few shelf talkers in there so that's please take that in a spirit of love.
My question is, what was your favorite part about debuting a YA book?
Oh man, I mean, I wish I'd gotten to do all the YA debut stuff that I heard all about beforehand. My debut came out in 2021. There wasn't I didn't get to do school visits. The fan art has been wonderful. I've seen so much wonderful fan art, and just getting to now that I have gotten to do events and go to stores and meet kids, especially trans kids, but all kids who are, who really need new stories. That's the best part, I think, meeting kids and seeing fan art.
Oh, so many more. Okay.
Yay.
Yay.
Okay.
Kind of off that, actually, is there something you would like to see us do for you and perhaps other authors in regards to school visits?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I still to this day have only done school visits on Zoom, so I'm probably the worst person to ask about that. I'm really hoping I get to do. What?
Or the best, because you have new ideas that we haven't heard yet.
I mean, gosh. Like I said before about Candace doing those events on Zoom where there's like making up RPGs and like having like kind of games and stuff, I think that's really fun. I don't know. I mean, I think I know from I did some school visits like that weren't related to the YA before the pandemic, and I know from doing those that like, you know, finding ways to keep kids entertained is especially like challenging, and like I do try to come up with games that the kids can do, like where we come up with 100 story ideas in 5 minutes, which is a thing I talk about in the book Never Say You Can't Survive. I feel like anything that you can do, like you go in there and you can feel that half the kids are like, actually this isn't even their favorite subject and they don't know who you are, and you know, I don't know. I mean, one thing I always do, especially if I'm there as like a visiting writer, is just try to make them understand that writing is a job that you can do, that it's actually fun. So I don't know, that was probably really incoherent, but I feel like finding ways to like make it more playful and fun and more of a game for the kids is a thing that I found is really important.
Okay. You know, I'm going to swing around here and then I'll come to you. Okay, who had thing?
Oh, thank you. So I know that with writing sometimes, especially when I'm writing a character that has an identity similar to myself, you know, queer characters, trans characters, it's a little difficult sometimes for me to put them in terrible situations. And I know you have to kill your darlings and things like that, but how do you balance that, making sure you maintain that joy and that safety for your trans audience while still not making it a book where nothing happens?
That's a really interesting question. Like, how do you kind of write horrible, terrible, scary things happening to characters who are, you know, who you love and want to protect and who you care about? I mean, to some extent, I think that, like you said, if nothing happens, it's not really a story. And I try to kind of think in terms of, like, I try to think very strategically about, like, especially nowadays, about trauma that I'm putting characters through, and like how I can, like, I think it's important for us to see people, you know, dealing with terrible stuff and surviving, because that is part of what stories do for us, is to reassure us that we can experience terrible things and still come out the other end and be able to keep going with our lives, even if trauma is trauma. It's not something that you just magically wish away or get rid of. But I do think that that is the thing that stories can do. And I think that, you know, I feel like my first drafts often go really far in one direction or the other. Like my first drafts, and this is the thing I think it's important to think about first drafts and revisions, because like you're never going to get this right in your first draft. Like in my first drafts, either nothing bad is happening and everybody's being like ridiculously, fakely nice to each other, and like it's just like pleasant day to you. I guess the story's over now. You know, and that could be a perfectly fine story if that's what you want. Like I love stories where it's just a cozy kind of thing. And then I go to the other extreme where it's just like, then they're like everybody's getting their heads lopped off and there's like a chainsaw elf and like, I don't know. You know, and and everybody's just being absurdly mean all the time and just being like, I hate you, I got a chainsaw. Anyway, so, and I feel like it's in revision that I kind of figure out the balance, and often it's about, you know, if I've got a first draft that I feel like it's a first draft that I can work with, usually there's some moments in there that I connect to where people are having some kind of emotional growth or something, and then the ending kind of pays it all off. And so I try to like kind of think about what in this story do I want to service with the rest of the story, if that makes sense, and how can I like, and but I do think in general we have a responsibility when we include trauma in stories to deal with it like thoughtfully and realistically, and not just inflict tons of trauma and then be like, ha, you know. I think we have to I think part of what trauma is an opportunity to show people comforting each other. And so that's part of what I think about. But it's really about, in revision, finding the version of the story that supports the character stuff that I've decided is like the kind of the cool part of the story.
Congratulations on your Marvel character. That's awesome. And with that, with the whole Marvel backlog of heroes and villains, who would you just like want to see your character interact with the most? And like, what do you want that storyline to look like? What's that like dream?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, I have this idea of so Escapade, her superpower is that she can change places with people. Like if you get her close enough to the president, she can be the president for a few hours. And I would love to have her meet Galactus, who's this giant kind of world-eating, super being. And just I picture Sheila with a big, weird pointy hat. I don't know. I've thought a lot about that. I don't know if I'll ever get to do it. I'm writing some more comics with her now, and she is meeting some really terrible, scary supervillains, which has been really intense, but also fun so far. So.
Congrats again. And also, thank you so much for the metaphor for describing and celebrating queerness and transness as a magical portal, because that super resonates with me.
Oh,
and I
I'm
will
so glad.
definitely take it back home to all my little queer babies. So thank you. And then also, my question is, do you have a specific book or character that you've written for your little Charlie or your inner child? Because it sounds like you do a lot of healing work through your writing.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't written anything for little kids. I've never written books below the YA level in terms of age. I did definitely write Victories Greater Than Death for the child version of me. That was the book that I wish I'd had when I was 12, I think. That's the book that would have really meant a lot to me when I was 12. So that's pretty much it, actually. Thanks. But I'm glad that metaphor worked for you. Thanks. Hi.
Sorry, I have the mic.
Okay,
I'll bring it
sorry.
up in a second.
Oh, sorry.
I love the way that you use fiction to imagine the future that we want, not just a dystopian future, but where we could imagine going that would be a good place to go. So I'd love to hear who are the authors and who are the art makers that you're looking to now to help to imagine that future.
Oh my gosh, yeah, authors who are helping me to imagine a better future. I'm going to say first and foremost, Malka Older. Malka Older wrote the Infomocracy trilogy, which is incredible, and it's about a future where we've basically fixed democracy, and it's actually working way better. It's more local, and it's more kind of responsive, and there are still issues, because otherwise there wouldn't be a story, but it's such an interesting view of the future, and she has a new kind of cozy mystery set on Jupiter coming out soon that I just love, called, I can't remember what it's called right now, but just look for anything by Malka Older. And what else? I mean, N.K. Jemisin comes to mind. I love all of her stuff. I love The City We Became, which I feel deals with cities in a way that makes me think of them differently as spaces and how we could make cities better. I don't know, there's so many, gosh. I'm always just thinking about the books I've read most recently. Oh man, I'll just stick with those two for now, but I'll post some more on Twitter later. Thank you.
Was there someone up here? Okay, this is the last T-shirt, but I hope everyone still asks questions. I'm happy to keep taking the mic around.
Hello. So you mentioned hoping that a lot of the current and last 100 years of characters could be quietly and gently set aside, which, I mean, solid. But I did want to know, bearing that in mind, what's your take on the queerification of existing characters? And I'm 100% thinking of the She-Ra remake, but there are others.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. I mean, I thought, I never watched She-Ra, back when it was first on. I never was familiar with She-Ra, so pretty much the only version of She-Ra that I know is the Netflix remake, where it's extremely queer and also just beautiful. And I loved it so much. I mean, I think that, there's no shade to people who are taking existing characters and reinventing them and kind of giving them a new life. I feel like that's a wonderful thing to do, and I have done a little bit of it myself and would love to do more. I'm not at all saying that that's not a good thing to do at all. And I feel like I love what's happening in the Wonder Woman comics right now, where there are trans characters being introduced. I love a lot of like existing characters, and but I do think that we need new ones as well. And I think that it's wonderful and awesome, and I'm super into it. I love that Doctor Who is just getting queerer and queerer. As somebody who grew up loving Doctor Who, I love seeing like Ncuti Gatwa as the new Doctor after seeing him in Sex Education. He's so amazing. I'm so excited.
Should we just pass the mic down the row?
So first, I want to let you know that my local comic shop just told me that they completely sold out of Marvel Pride today.
Thanks for letting me know. Oh my God.
Including my copy. So, now I've got to wait.
I hope you can get one.
And then secondly, can we find a way so that we could all produce small, productions of The Bad Cad in our stores?
Oh man, I wondered if somebody's going to ask that. I don't think I have the script anymore. I have photos, but I don't have the script anymore. I think
Write
the script
a new
was,
one.
I think the script was pretty basic too. But yeah, I wish I still had the actual script. I do have the fake newspaper I made in 3rd grade, but I don't have The Bad Cat anymore. I'm really sad. I should. My mom has so much stuff, and she's mailed me boxes of old stuff, so I should go through them. I don't know.
So I just wanted to ask what the process was like for creating a new character for Marvel. Is it something that you came to them with? Did they come to you? What did that look like?
Yeah, that was a long process, creating a new character for Marvel. It was basically, it took a long time, basically. Like, I had been talking to various folks at Marvel about writing for them for a while, and then finally I started working with the editor I'm working with now, who was an assistant editor at the time. And, we started talking about, I did like a few little things, like I did a She-Hulk story that was part of a larger thing a few years ago. But basically, they started talking to me about creating a new trans character, I think in 2018 or 2019. And that was going to be a very different version, because back then Marvel was doing a lot of different stuff. They wanted the character to be an inhuman rather than a mutant, because that was what they were doing at the time. And so we just I kept talking back and forth with them, and then I didn't hear from them for like a year or so, and I thought, okay, well, that's obviously not happening anymore. But then they came back to me and said, now is the time, we're going to do it. And so it was really this one editor, Sarah Brunstad, who really spearheaded it and kind of made it happen, I feel like. And I'm so grateful to her for like figuring out a way to kind of bring this character out into the world. And it was super collaborative. Like, we talked a ton about the character. I came up with the superpower and a lot of the kind of life stuff and the name and but her superhero name, Escapade, actually came from Anita Okoye, who's Sarah's assistant. We had this long meeting where we were tossing names back and forth, and like we couldn't have a name that had ever been used anywhere for any copyrighted character, so that took a while. I was like, what about this? Oh, that's a Transformers character. What about this? That's a, there was just like it was a thing. Like coming up with a new superhero name in this day and age is really hard. So Anita just suggested Escapade, and it was immediately like, yes, thank you, oh my God. And then the artists came up with a lot of the design stuff. So it was a huge collaborative process, which is really how it should be in comics, I feel like. It shouldn't be some writer being like, this is what it's going to be, because then you get boring comics. But thank you. We have time for like one or two more questions?
Still have the microphone. Meg! Okay.
Okay.
to roll this back around to your answer to Nicole's question, who do you really want us to read to write new talkers in our sci-fi section?
Oh my God, so many people. I mean, I have a Goodreads, and if you look at my Goodreads, you'll see the books that I've reviewed, which are books that I personally love. I mean, it's not everything I've read, but I try to, if I really love something, I try to review it on Goodreads to try to, especially if it's a marginalized author, to try to counteract some of the negativity they might be getting on there. And oh gosh, I mean, so many authors have amazing, just so many amazing authors writing right now. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Maggie Takuda Hall. She's in YA. Maggie Takuda Hall is incredible. I'm sorry, I'm having brain freeze. But if you go to my Goodreads, there's just like so many reviews of authors whose books I love, and like part of the problem is that I get to read books months before they come out, so by the time they're out, I'm like, literally the only thing that's coming into my mind right now is books that come out in a month or two. So actually, I'm going to plug some books that are coming out soon, because that's easier than plugging books that have already come out. So a book that comes out in a month or so is The Bruising of Kilwa, Qilwa, by Nassim Jamnia, who actually gave me feedback on the Marvel Comics thing. And they are a trans, non-binary author, I think living in Reno, Nevada. I'm going to meet them soon. And it's this amazing story about blood magic, and a lot of the characters are trans or non-binary, and it's just so beautiful. That's published by Tachyon Books. A book that I read a while ago that comes out this fall is The Story of the 100 Promises by Neil Cochrane, which is a trans fairy tale that's just like beautiful. I just read a book that comes out in August, I think, called The Women Could Fly by Megan Giddings, which just rocked my world. I haven't quite finished it yet, but it's so good. It's about a world where basically there are laws against witchcraft, and people are not quite sure if witchcraft is real or not. But if you're a woman or trans or non-binary or any gender other than cis man, if you're not married by the age of 30, you have to register with the state, and then you can't really have a job anymore, and they test you once a week to see if you're a witch. And it's like basically about this super weird, it's like our world, but just got this weird, super oppressive, messed up thing. And the main character is 28, and everybody's like, you better get going, or you won't be able to have a life soon. And it's an amazing book. It's so beautifully written. So that's off the top of my head. But also look at my Goodreads. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Book to the Bookstore Education Podcast, brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!